Hey guys, good evening. Thank you so much for tuning in. I've got today. It's me, Anirudh. I'm a security researcher working with CloudSec, and we'll try and go and deep dive into what exactly is Follina. So it's been dubbed as CV 2022-30190. I'll share my screen now, and let's see. We've got a webinar with a small POC in it as well. So I think my screen should be visible now. Okay. So let's start off with what exactly does the name Follina mean, right? So pretty weird name, pretty weird for a security vulnerability to be, given. So it's the original exploit code which was found, because of which it was actually reported to Microsoft. It had a RAR file in it called, and it had the name of the RAR file included 0438, which is actually a area code inside Italy for a place called Follina. That's how the thing got its name. So it's a 0-day remote code execution vulnerability, which still has no patch, by the way. It only has workarounds, official workarounds from Microsoft as well, which we'll discuss at the end of the webinar. And why is it so important? Because it affects anything and everything which includes the URI protocol schemas. So currently, this vulnerability includes something called as MSDT, which we'll talk in detail of how exactly does that happen. We'll set up the stage, talk about what is the historical impact of similar sort of vulnerabilities. How does it, how has it always happened, and the attack vectors as well. Then we look at a small POC, and then we can look at the impact factor, also the workarounds as well as detection mechanisms. So that's the agenda. That's how I have structured this particular webinar. So just to give an introduction as to how this came into picture. So there was a security researcher by the Twitter handle named Crazy Man Army who was given the credit for this vulnerability, by the way. He found a sample out in the wild while hunting for an older vulnerability. A sample which he found, which was very weird according to him, because it was using something called as MSDT to invoke PowerShell and run commands. So he found it pretty weird, and he reported the same to Microsoft. At that point of time, Microsoft did not pay much attention, and because it included an attack vector of social engineering, so it was not given a CV number, as well as it was not publicly disclosed at that point of time. Now this is early April, right? Now this has come into picture very recently. 27th May is the day that we can trace it back to being very popular in the security community. But then wild exploitation had already started before 12th of April, when Crazy Man actually reported this particular bug to Microsoft. So what exactly is MSDT? That's something that we've that is the meat of the matter. Now, what exactly is MSDT? It's something called as Microsoft Support Diagnostic Tool. I think everybody has encountered Wi-Fi problems, Bluetooth problems on Windows, and while troubleshooting them, there's a dialog box or there's a prompt which opens up. That's exactly what Microsoft Support Diagnostic Tool is. Now, why is it problematic? Because there is a very old attack vector, 2 years old, in fact. There's a research paper which we'll be talking about, which was out in the open in August 2020, which actually did talk about how can you use MSDT to run or invoke PowerShell. So in this case, we'll be using something called as a program compatibility wizard, which has the authority to run arbitrary programs. And then how do you run commands from it? How do you invoke PowerShell? All that we'll be discussing as to, while setting up the stage for the POC. So that's exactly what MSDT is. Now, MSDT in particular is the protocol that helps you open Microsoft Support Diagnostic Tool from the CLI. So every string that you pass on actually gets passed on to something called as the MSDT.exe. So that's the problematic thing. So we might have read about Word getting affected, or only Microsoft Word being affected. That's not the case. The same vulnerability or the same bug was actually a part of the last Teams release as well, Microsoft Teams, which was using the same thing, which could have been exploited in a similar manner, which was actually patched by Microsoft last year itself, but it was not publicly disclosed. So yeah, that's what we are dealing with here, and that's the severity. So, talking about the vulnerability analysis, how does this come into picture, or how do you actually, how are the threat actors exploiting this in the wild? To put it in a very brief summary, you have to create something called as a malicious document. So, in itself, a document is a zip file. So, you can unzip that file and then look at all the relationship schemas which are present inside, all the all the XML files which are there inside, which makes it a document. So now here what you can do is there's a file called document.rels.xml. It's a relationship schema file where there are mentions of external schemas as well, so you can potentially change that document and point it towards an attacker control server, and from there there's a code file which gets fetched, and that's an HTML file. We'll talk about why exactly HTML. That question is actually very valid. So if you look at the screenshot that I've added, the last relationship ID, which is RID4, has something called a target, which is the xmlformats.com, which is a malicious domain, which was a malicious domain. This is an actual file which we found in the wild. This is the original file which was, because of which it was reported to Microsoft. So it was using this particular HTML, it was using a base64 encoded command to run, which also is there on the right side. So what happens is there's a target, there's a attacker control server to which your maliciously created document is pointing. Once you've essentially fished a person or sent that as an email or an attachment, a person opens that into his on his own computer, and then it reaches back to the attacker control server, and then it downloads that HTML file, tries to render it where we have our payload, and then it invokes PowerShell and runs all the commands. So that's the data flow, or that's how it is actually happening. Now, as I've covered in a brief section, why and how old this vulnerability actually is in the market, it's not new at all. This has been out in the open since August 2020, and this is actually an excerpt from the bachelor's thesis of a security researcher named Benjamin Allpeter, who published this. And he mentioned that MSDT could actually be used, or the MS-MSDT protocol could actually be used to invoke PowerShell. And then he goes on to explain other schemas as well. To give him credit, Search MS is the new vulnerability which has come out, and then he mentions it in the next para. So, he tries to explain how these protocols or the protocols which are opening support diagnostic tool in this particular case are could be potential use cases for installing ransomware or installing stealers, etc., on your on your local system. So it's not a new thing to be around. It's actually old. What is new is the being exploited in the wild. That was something. So now let's talk about the attack vector, right? Why is this so difficult to deal with? Why is this vulnerability so prevalent? Why is it so impactful? Because it has got two vectors. One is zero click, and one is the other one would be the single click vector. How exactly is it zero click? So if you have something called as a preview pane open, so I've added a screenshot here as well. If you have something called as the preview pane open, which basically helps you looking into a preview of the document that you're opening. If that is the case, then if you hover over the document, then that itself is enough to compromise your computer, compromise your system. So that's the zero click vector. Then we've got the single click vector. So any file or any Word document, if you do not have the preview pane enabled by default, then by default, if you try and download a document and try and open it or try to change it, then there is a click that you have to make, which is enable editing. So by default, that happens if you download any document from from the internet. So if that happens, you just need to click on enable editing, which most of the people will, and then you basically hand over your system to the attacker. That's how easy it is. So that's why it's it's a very impactful vulnerability. Talking about why Office, or why Office is considered as the major attack scenario, because it's easier for the attacker to involve or to maliciously make a document. right? Now we've already seen in the past, macros being involved. That makes it even more dangerous, because in this case, there are no macros involved. It's a completely new, sorry, it's a different sort of attack vector, right? Where in this case we have to understand something called as the MS-HTML. So if you remember, I was talking about why HTML is being involved here. So there's a rendering engine in Word called MS-HTML, which actually executes JavaScript payloads. That's what we are trying to do. We are trying, from the attacker server, we are trying to fetch maliciously encoded JavaScript payload which has MSDT, and which tries to invoke MSDT, and using MSDT we'll be invoking PowerShell. So that's why MS-HTML is important. And a similar attack vector or a similar vulnerability was 2021-40444, which actually affected MS-HTML itself, right? So this is a major, or this is the general flowchart, or information flow which happens. Um, Sorry for that. Just give me a second. Yeah, I'll be sharing my screen again. Okay. Yeah. So, as we were talking about, why exactly, how does this happen, or how is the infrastructure, how does the infrastructure look like? So, there's an attacker CDN where you have, or the attacker server where you have the HTML payload hosted. Now you have a maliciously encoded document where you've already made sure that if the document opens, it reaches out to your server, tries to download the HTML file, and then MS-HTML renders it. So that's basically what we are trying to do here. How do you do this? So now, setting up the stage for the POC, we'll try and understand how does this exactly happen. So this, as we've already established, right, this is actually a zip file. So once you unzip it, we've got these particular files which are out in the open. So we've got an underscore rels file, which basically means relationships. Now inside that, there's a file called document.xml.rels, right? In there, we've got multiple schemas, or multiple schemas which need to be fetched every time when a document opens. So in there, there's a target type called external, which tries to reach out to an external server. In this case, as we've seen in the file, it's called coolrat.xyz, and then the file name was loading.html. Now, what's one more thing which is important here is the type. The type has been defined as OLE object, which helps Microsoft understand that here MS-HTML would be required to render the HTML output. So that's basically all you need to do. All you need to do to make a malicious document. You need to unzip it, and make these changes into add a relationship tag for your attacker control server, and that's where you have to host your HTML file. Now, now that we've talked about it, we understand. Now that we understand what exactly and why exactly is it happening, we talk about Follina. So, what exactly is Follina? Because this is all historical context. We talk about, we talk about how MS-HTML actually, is being used here, which is an older vulnerability. But then, what exactly is Follina? So Follina involves MSDT protocol, right? As we talked about in the starting. So this is what a basic payload will look like. So we have MSDT, which is invoking the MSDT.exe, and then we've got a bunch of parameters. Now in here, the most important parameter is the IT underscore browse for file. Right, it has got multiple conditions, and the security research which went behind it was you can open a particular exe or an application on your system using this particular parameter. So that's what it could have been used for, but now, according to the research, it could also be used to invoke PowerShell commands. So now there are a bunch of conditions here. Now you see that there are multiple directory traversals that we are making here, and then there is an evaluation of the PowerShell command, which is being done by the dollar and the parenthesis, and it has to be appended by a .exe. So the payload has to have these or satisfy these particular conditions to execute. Now, this basically means that you can run all sort of PowerShell commands. Now, that opens up a lot of problematic things. You can install a stealer. You can instruct the command to install a dropper, install ransomwares, gain persistence, a lot of things, right? So that's what the basic of the basic Follina payload structure would look like, and that's how the IT underscore browse for file parameter is being used. Um, Now, in the wild, we've seen a lot of, I think most of you must have seen a lot of payloads which have a lot of buffer space. Like there are a lot of comments which have been done. I think, yeah. So there must have been a lot of comments which have been done in the wild. I've removed the redundant bytes here, but that is to make sure that you are crossing something called as a limit of 4096 bytes. That's because that's how MS HTML has been made. If the file being fetched is not greater than 4096 bytes, it gets treated very differently. Most in cases it won't get rendered, so your payload won't work. That's why you'll see a lot of payloads in the wild having redundant bytes, comments, etc., etc. The aim is to make sure that your file is more than 4096 bytes. Now, we talk about the meat of the matter, right? Why are we talking about this vulnerability, and how is it so important? And what all has CloudSec found while hunting for the same threats in the wild? So we've already seen a lot of campaigns against Middle East, and in this case, as you see, there's a VIP invitation to Doha Expo, and once a person opens this particular document, it basically leads to this particular payload being executed. Now, there's a very special thing that the payload is doing here, which is basically mounting a web DAV drive to install a dropper or install a ransomware, malware probably. So now, what exactly is the benefit here of mounting a drive? Is if you try to do forensic analysis or try to PCAP capture it, if you're trying to capture PCAPs, then in this case you won't be able to intercept traffic because it has mounted a drive. So it's a very crafty way of installing a ransomware, which this particular vulnerability lets you do, right? So it's not just the security researchers which are getting crafty day by day, it's also the threat actors who are doing the same. Now, how is this exactly working? So we have, so in this case, this was the IP address, and the C2 server was files.attend.doha.expo.com. It was so it was treating Windows and Linux systems differently. Once it identifies a Windows computer, it tries and uses the malicious LNK files, which are shortcut files, and then deploys a malware in this case. Now, for a Linux machine, it also does something which is installs a Mirai variant, as seen in the virus total screenshot. So that's a sample that we had acquired. Now, another case that we found which was very interesting, is the fake monkeypox awareness campaign which was running around. And once you open this document, which looked like this, actually leads to exploitation and running of this particular code, which is right there in the left. So what is special about this campaign, right? So there's always something or some or the other way that the attacker is using craftily to execute a payload. Here you can see that there is a parameter called @type, which basically quite literally opens the gates of hell, right? A PowerShell command which lets you invoke .NET framework. Now, as we all know, .NET framework is very heavily used by red teamers because it's a very crafty way of interacting with Win32 APIs and essentially trying to do a lot of stuff in using your system. So it quite literally gives attacker a lot of leverage, right? So this is one example, which was using .NET framework C#. Yeah, so one of the first campaigns that we've seen in the wild was also a Chinese threat actor group called TA413, which was impersonating the Women Empowerment Desk of the Central Tibetan Administration. Similar attack vector, once you open it, it basically, the Chinese threat actor group owns your system. So we've also seen, because CloudSec Global Threat Research Team also triages a lot of dark web forums. So we've seen a lot of activity and we've seen people selling and buying mass exploitation kits. We've also seen people talking about exploits trying to evade detection mechanisms, antivirus mechanisms, sandbox mechanisms. Screenshots are there, and we've seen a lot of them in the past, past one and a half week. Um, Now let's talk about the exploit. So this is a very simple flowchart that, and we'll also look at the POC now. So there's a malicious document which is probably sent via an email, and then in the victim machine, once you open or probably click, hover over it if you've got the preview panel, then there is an outbound connection to your attacker control server, which fetches the code, which has your MSDT or Follina vulnerability, and tries to invoke PowerShell commands. That's basically all that we are trying to do. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and try and show you a small POC of it. Yeah. So think of the right side of my screen as the victim machine, and think of the left side of my screen as the attacker machine. Once I've built a, RTF file, or it could be a doc file. Once you've clicked that, and if you have preview pane enabled, and if you click on or probably hover over this, once you have done that, it'll tries to execute my payload, and then we've got the calculator open, right? So that's exactly what we wanted to do. So we've opened calculator in this case to show just as a POC, but then the possibilities are endless, right? This is a remote code execution vulnerability. The possibilities completely depend on of the intent of the attacker, right? How the attacker wants to exploit your system. How does he? What is his intent? What is his motivation? Is it a nation state actor who is dealing with intelligence? Then he'll try and exfiltrate data. If it's a APT which wants to get monetarily harm you, then it will be all about money. So that's how vast the impact would be. To understand that, I'll try and brief about the attack surface, which is probably immense. So even though we've shifted towards Google Apps a lot, Microsoft Office 365 still is one of the most majorly used Office application to edit your documents, and that's why it's very, very, very important to not open maliciously coded documents. There are some workarounds to stop this vulnerability from happening, and that we'll discuss at the end of the webinar. So just to understand that, Microsoft Office 365 actually covered 48.08% of the market share till February 2022. So that's a massive attack surface, and it's not limited to just Microsoft Office 365. Anything that could be used to invoke MSDT would be affected. So that's the attack surface. Now, understanding the impact, as we've already talked about it, APTs and threat actors have already started exploiting this on scale. We could already see Mirai being used, and one of the major impacts which could happen is there are so many researches which has already been out in the open, which actually tells you how to bypass the defender and directly steal your NTLM hashes. Now that's a very massive open pothole, because that could essentially compromise your AD infrastructure, and we already know that how heavily AD is used in in today's infrastructure. So once an attacker gets hold of your NTLM hash, he can probably and possibly try and brute force it, and then affect your whole AD infrastructure. That's how dangerous this could be. We've already seen US $14 billion in ransomware payments in the last year itself. So it's not just how much damage ransomware has done. It's also about how many so this is only the payments that has been done. So the damages would have been even more. We've already seen APT groups, as we've discussed, APT groups and nation state entities who've already using this in mass scale tactics, mass scale phishing attacks. So it's the impact is whatever the attacker has the intent of doing, right? So that's how dangerous this vulnerability is. Let's talk about workarounds now, right? How do you stop this from happening? So there are two workarounds to this vulnerability. It's still a 0-day, so there are no patches. Now, what are the workarounds then? So there are two. First is you completely disable the MSDT URL protocol. So essentially, MSDT won't get launched, right? So you can do that by following the now. The second one is actually pretty interesting. You can enable something called as an attack surface reduction rule. It's block office create process rule for Defender. Now, how does that help you? It's basically, if you once you open a Word file onto your system, it opens a process called winword.exe. If it is a maliciously formed document, it will open a subprocess or a child process named msdt.exe. So this rule will effectively block any sub process being created from Microsoft Office, which is winword.exe in this case. So that's basically what will happen. Now, in the latest or the latest version of Defender or the updated version, it also tries and identify if you're trying to invoke MSDT using command line, or if there is a maliciously if there is that malicious HTML code which is being fetched, as the following means, right? It identifies that as a Trojan. So that's an additional plus pointer which Microsoft has done to probably prevent it. Microsoft has also updated its blog since 30th May. That was when it was first updated or made published. Then it has also they have updated on 7th of June, when they've added a bunch of FAQs and busted a couple of more unofficial workarounds, which could which were not basically viable. So we are only covering the viable ones, or which could be used to stop this from exploitation. Now, for threat hunters, it's important to detect a a vulnerable machine or an already exploited machine. So how do you do that? You use something called as a Sigma framework. Now it's very similar to the Yara rules that we see in our daily lives. So it's a signature based string identification. So if the command line, as you can see in the screenshot, if the command line includes msmsdt and then there is a parameter passed ID, that's the search string here. We can be more specific. We can try and play around with this. So you can create your own Sigma rules. Something like that could be used. Or the other more effective one would be to look at the outbound connections being made using your Microsoft Office, right? So you can use this wedge key to identify all the outbound connections which were being made, the IP addresses, etc., which will be listed here. That is a more effective way of identifying if your machine has been compromised or not. So those are the two ways that you can actually use to hunt for threats. Summing what we've covered in the last 30 minutes is basically we talked about what exactly is Follina, how impactful it is, what is the historical importance of this vulnerability, and how it's not a new attack vector at all. This has been around for quite some time, 2 years to be exact. We've had a research paper which was out in the open since August 2020, which explained how MSMSDT could be used. Then we talked about the campaigns which were using this particular vulnerability affecting Middle East. We also talked about the in-depth payload analysis, what exactly was Follina, then a small POC, and then we talked about the official workarounds and detection mechanisms. So this is actually it from my end. The floor is now open for questions, guys. If anybody has any questions, we can probably take that up. Cool. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Cool. Awesome. I don't think that there are any questions. Sile, floor is all yours.
Yeah, then we can wrap the session up.